She didn't mean to invite him. She didn't even know who he was when she hit send at nearly midnight, wine glass half empty, pride fully gone. One wrong name, one impulsive message, one stranger who said yes, and arrived in a black car she couldn't afford to look at too long. Natalie Andrade thought she was asking for a favor. What she got instead was the one thing she'd spent years convincing herself she didn't need. If this already has you curious, you're not alone. Hit that like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. It means more than you know.
I'm happy you're here. Let's experience this story together.
Natalie Andrade had a system. It wasn't written anywhere, and she'd never explained it out loud. But it existed, the way most survival strategies do, quietly, efficiently, and with just enough distance to keep her from getting hurt again. The system had exactly 3 components. Work hard enough to stay tired, keep the apartment clean enough to feel in control, and never, under any circumstances, send a message you'd regret before 8 a.m. She broke the 3rd rule at 11:47 on a Thursday night. It started as most disasters do, with good intentions. Her best friend Clara had called that afternoon, voice pitched 3 octaves higher than usual, to announce that the seating chart for her Hampton wedding was finalized, and that every single table had been arranged in couples. "You'll figure something out," Clara had said, with the breezy confidence of someone who had never, not once in her adult life, shown up anywhere alone. Natalie had said, "Of course." Then she'd gone home, opened a bottle of Côte du Rhône, cut into a wedge of aged Gouda, and sat on her living room floor with her back against the couch, while Freud, a grey tabby with the emotional range of a philosophy professor, stared at her from the coffee table with obvious judgment. "Don't look at me like that," Natalie said. Freud blinked once and looked away. By glass 2, she was scrolling through her contacts with the particular desperation of someone who knows the answer isn't there, but keeps looking anyway. By glass 3, the names had blurred into a soft inventory of bad ideas and expired possibilities. And then, somewhere between the wine and the Gouda, and the unbearable smug silence of her cat, her thumb stopped. Edward M. Edward Matson. They'd had 3 classes together at NYU, sat near each other twice, shared notes once during a particularly brutal midterm week. He was kind, forgettable in the best possible way, the kind of person who wouldn't make things weird. She typed before she could think. That was the thing about Natalie. She was excellent at thinking, except for the exact moments when thinking was most required. "Would you be willing to pretend to like me for a few hours at a wedding? I promise I won't embarrass you." Much. She hit send. Then she put the phone face down on the carpet, covered her eyes with her forearm, and told herself she would check it in the morning. She was asleep by midnight, Freud curled into the bend of her knees like a warm, unimpressed comma. The phone buzzed at 7:14 a.m. She saw the light before she saw the words, and for a half-second she'd forgotten entirely. Then the memory hit her like cold water. She grabbed the phone with both hands, squinting against the brightness. "I'll take it. What time should I pick you up?" Natalie read it 3 times. Then she sat up, disturbing Freud, who leaped off the bed with a noise of profound irritation. She looked at the message again. She looked at the name above it. The contact photo, a blurry selfie from someone's graduation rooftop party, summer light, a wide, easy grin. Edward M. Okay. This was fine. This was, actually, a reasonable adult solution to a completely manageable social situation. Edward was kind, forgettable. They'd shared notes during midterms. She could do this. She typed back, "Saturday, 2 p.m. I'll text you the address." Then she put the phone down, pressed both palms flat against the mattress, and took a breath that was almost steady. Freud reappeared in the doorway, watching her with the particular intensity he reserved for moments he seemed to understand were significant. "It's fine," Natalie told him. He sat down and wrapped his tail around his paws, which meant he disagreed. She spent the next 48 hours operating on the clean, quiet conviction that she'd solved her problem. She found the dress, emerald green, silk blend, the kind of dress that made her feel like someone who had their life loosely assembled. She confirmed the hotel. She texted Clara a strategic update that revealed nothing. She did not think about the wedding. She did not think about her ex, Raphael, who would almost certainly be there with the woman he'd started dating 3 weeks after telling Natalie she was amazing but not quite right. 4 years. Amazing but not quite right. She'd packed the phrase away like something you keep even though it no longer fits, because throwing it out feels like admitting something you're not ready to admit. Saturday arrived the way difficult things always do, without warning and slightly earlier than expected. At 1:58 p.m. she heard a car outside. She picked up her phone to text Edward that she was on her way down, glanced out her window toward the street below, and went completely still. The car was black. Long, seamless, expensive in a way that made the street around it look slightly inadequate. A driver stood beside it in a dark jacket, hands behind his back, and next to the driver, seated, composed, watching the building entrance with an expression that suggested he was accustomed to waiting for nothing and no one, was a man she had absolutely never seen before in her life. The elevator doors opened, and Natalie stepped into the lobby already second-guessing every decision she'd made since Thursday night. She'd spent Saturday morning doing what she did best when anxiety was circling. She cleaned, reorganized the kitchen cabinet she'd been ignoring since March, refolded every blanket on the couch, gave Freud fresh water twice, even though his bowl was still half full. By noon, the apartment was spotless and she was out of distractions, which meant she had to actually get dressed, actually do her makeup, and actually go downstairs to meet a man she'd accidentally texted at midnight. The emerald dress fit the way she'd remembered. The heels were sensible enough to survive a reception and elegant enough to not look like she'd prioritized comfort. She'd pulled her dark hair up, loose, intentional, and added the gold earrings Clara had given her 2 Christmases ago with the instructions, "Wear these when you need to feel like yourself." She needed that today. Marcus, the doorman, held the glass door open with his usual quiet nod. The October air came first, cool, slightly sharp, carrying the smell of someone's coffee from the cafe across the street and the distant sound of a delivery truck reversing somewhere down the block. Brooklyn on a Saturday afternoon, unhurried, layered, real. Then she saw the car, black, long and immaculate in a way that made the surrounding street look slightly underdressed. It sat at the curb with the particular stillness of something that didn't need to announce itself. A driver stood beside it, dark jacket, white gloves, hands folded behind his back, and next to him turned slightly toward the building entrance, as if he'd already calculated exactly when she would appear, was a man she had never seen before in her life. Natalie stopped walking. He was in a wheelchair, matte black, sleek, engineered with the kind of precision that made it look less like a medical device and more like something that belonged in a design exhibition. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a dark fitted shirt. No tie, no visible effort to impress. But the impression arrived anyway, quiet and complete, the way expensive things always do, without trying. He was younger than she'd braced for. Dark hair, close cut, a jawline that could have been a structural decision. And eyes, when they found hers across the 10 feet of Brooklyn sidewalk separating them, that were so direct it felt like being asked a question she hadn't prepared for. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. She counted. "You're clearly not who I thought you were," Natalie said. His expression didn't shift, not even slightly. Clearly. A pause, unhurried and deliberate. "Do you still want the arrangement?" It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't entirely a question either. It existed somewhere in between, the register of a man accustomed to people making rapid recalculations in his presence and no longer curious about what they'd conclude. "Who are you?" she asked. "James Menezes." The name meant nothing to her in that moment. That would change 20 minutes into the drive, when she'd quietly search it on her phone and spend the remainder of the trip pretending she hadn't. James Menezes, 34, co-founder of the Meridian Group, private equity, biotech, infrastructure holdings across 12 countries. Forbes had described him as relentlessly private. The Times had simply called him formidable. There were almost no personal photographs. She was currently standing on a Brooklyn sidewalk arguing logistics with him. "You answered a message meant for someone else," she said. "Edward Matson and I share an area code prefix. It happens." He said it without apology, the way someone states weather. I had reason to attend the event in the Hamptons. Your message offered a workable solution. Natalie stared at him. You're attending a stranger's wedding because it's a workable solution. Are you getting in the car? Every reasonable instinct she had said no. Wrong number, wrong man. A car she couldn't afford to look at directly, and a driver wearing actual white gloves. Her system, the quiet survival architecture she'd built across 4 careful years, said go back upstairs, text Clara an excuse, open another bottle of wine. She smoothed the front of her dress, lifted her chin precisely 2 degrees, and got in the car. The interior smelled like leather and something faintly warm, cedar maybe, or something close. The seats were pale grey. The partition between them and the driver was up. The city moved past the tinted windows in that specific Saturday afternoon light that makes everything in New York look like it's been slightly improved. James was on his phone within 30 seconds. Typing, not scrolling, typing, with the focused economy of someone who treated silence as productive space rather than social awkwardness. It was, Natalie decided, extraordinarily annoying. You could have told me you weren't Edward, she said. You didn't ask. He didn't look up. Your message outlined the parameters clearly. I met them. The parameters. She turned from the window. You're describing a wedding as parameters. Would you prefer I called it something else? I'd prefer a normal sentence from a normal person. Now he looked up, and the steadiness of it caught her off guard, the way directness always does when you're not expecting it. I don't know that normal is something either of us is particularly good at. Natalie opened her mouth, closed it. Outside, the bridge arched above them as the car crossed toward the expressway. Manhattan visible in the distance, glass towers catching the October light, indifferent and luminous and absolutely unconcerned with the strange electric tension building in the back seat of a car that was definitely not hers. The Hamptons in October had a particular kind of beauty that felt almost accidental. The summer crowds were gone, leaving behind clean air, quieter roads, and the kind of light that only arrives when a season is preparing to let go, golden, slightly melancholy, slanting through trees that had just begun to turn. The venue was a restored estate set back from the water, all white cedar shingles and wraparound porches and flower arrangements that probably cost more than Natalie's monthly rent. Inside, the ceremony room glowed with candlelight and the soft warmth of 100 people dressed in their most careful versions of themselves. Natalie and James arrived with 4 minutes to spare. The logistics of entering had been quieter than she'd expected. The venue was accessible, genuinely, thoughtfully so, not the performative kind that puts a ramp beside a staircase and calls it done. James moved through the space with a self-possession that made the chair irrelevant, the way confidence always renders certain details secondary. Nobody stared, or if they did, they were smart enough to do it only once. They found their seats near the aisle, 3rd row from the front, just as the string quartet shifted into something low and unhurried. Clara's ceremony, like Clara herself, was warm and slightly chaotic and completely sincere. Natalie felt the familiar tightness in her throat that always arrived at weddings. Not sadness exactly, more like the emotional equivalent of pressing on a bruise you'd forgotten was there. You're clenching your jaw, James said quietly, leaning just slightly toward her. I'm not. You are. Left side. She consciously relaxed it. How would you even notice that? I notice things, said simply. Not a boast, just a fact. They were close enough that she could smell his cologne, something clean and dry with a bass note she couldn't name, but would recognize afterward in the vague, inconvenient way scent memory works. She kept her eyes forward. We should establish parameters, James said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it beneath the music. You really like that word. It's a useful word. Do you want the conversation or not? Natalie turned her head just slightly toward him. Fine. Parameters. I'll hold your hand when it's socially appropriate. You won't ask about my business or my medical history. Neither of us will fabricate a backstory more complicated than necessary. If someone asks, we met through a mutual friend and left it at that. And if someone pushes, change the subject. You seem capable of that. She almost smiled. What makes you say that? You've redirected this conversation 4 times since we sat down. She had. She hadn't realized he'd been counting. The awareness of being observed, not intrusively but carefully, settled over her like something she didn't have an immediate category for. Fine, she said, but I get to set one rule too. A pause. Go ahead. Don't be impressive on purpose. If you're interesting, be interesting accidentally. I can't do a whole evening of performance. Something shifted in his expression, small, genuine, almost surprised. Agreed, he said. And then, after a beat, that's a surprisingly specific request. I'm a surprisingly specific person. The officiant began to speak, and they both turned forward, but the air between them had changed in some molecular way, less like strangers managing proximity and more like 2 people who had accidentally revealed something true about themselves and were now quietly deciding what to do with it. The reception was held on the back terrace, strung with Edison lights that turned the October dusk into something from a photograph. Natalie got champagne. James declined the flute a server offered and asked for still water with the kind of quiet authority that made it sound like a preference rather than a limitation. They stayed near the edge of the terrace for the first hour, which suited them both. Clara found them at the second hour, glowing with newlywed energy and a very specific expression Natalie recognized as, "I have questions, and I am too polite to ask all of them right now." She shook James's hand with both of hers, told him she'd heard wonderful things, a complete fabrication delivered with total conviction, and disappeared back into her wedding with a backward glance at Natalie that communicated volumes. The best man gave a toast that was long and slightly self-congratulatory. 63 seconds too long, James murmured beside her. Natalie turned to look at him. You timed it? I estimated. Why? Something to do while he found his point. He glanced at her sideways. He never quite found it. It was so dry, so precisely observed, delivered with such complete composure, that Natalie laughed, a real one, sudden and unguarded, the kind that arrives before you've decided to allow it. Several people nearby looked over. She didn't care. James watched her with an expression she couldn't read, except to say it wasn't indifferent. It was the opposite of indifferent. He looked for just a moment, like a man recalibrating something he thought he'd already understood. By the time the dancing started, 3 different phones had captured them together, heads inclined toward each other, her laughing, him watching her with that unreadable attention. The photos, uploaded without context or caption, would find their way across platforms before midnight. Neither of them knew yet, and neither of them knew what those photographs were about to set in motion. The notification appeared at 6:43 a.m. Natalie was still half asleep, Freud arranged across her shins like a warm, inconsiderate blanket, when her phone lit up on the nightstand with the particular persistence of something that wasn't going to wait. She reached for it with her eyes still mostly closed, expecting Clara's post-wedding debrief or possibly a notification from the coffee app she kept forgetting to delete. What she found instead were 17 tagged photos, 4 direct messages from people she barely remembered, and a text from her college roommate that said simply, "Natalie, who is he?" She sat up. Freud protested audibly. The photos were from the reception, candid, naturally lit by those Edison strings, the kind of images that look effortless because the moment actually was. In one, she was laughing at something just off camera, champagne flute loose in her fingers, head tilted back. James was beside her, not laughing, but watching her with an expression so focused and unguarded that it read on a screen as something unmistakably intimate. In another, they were leaning toward each other during the toasts, close, unhurried, like people who had developed their own private geometry without noticing. They looked in every single frame like 2 people who had been choosing each other for a long time. Natalie put the phone face down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling. "This," she told Freud, "is a problem." Freud stepped onto her stomach and sat down. She'd almost convinced herself it was manageable, a minor social media flare-up, the kind that burns for 48 hours and disappears, when her phone rang at noon with a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail, then it rang again, then a third time. She answered, "Ms. Andrade." The voice was a woman's, precise, unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone who had never once in her professional life left a thought unfinished. "My name is Christina Vale. I'm a managing partner at Meridian Group. I'd like to speak with you about the photographs currently circulating online." Natalie was standing in her kitchen, still in the oversized NYU shirt she'd slept in, a half-eaten piece of toast on the counter beside her. The distance between that image and the voice on the phone was almost funny. "How did you get this number?" Natalie asked. "It wasn't difficult," said without apology, the way certain people state things they consider irrelevant. "The photographs have significant implications for James's public profile. I'd like to understand the nature of your connection before this develops further." "With respect," Natalie said carefully, "that sounds like a conversation you should be having with James." "I've already spoken with James." A pause, brief, surgical. "Now I'm speaking with you." The call ended 2 minutes later, cordially, which somehow felt worse than if it had ended badly. Natalie put her phone on the counter and looked at her toast. Then she looked at Freud, who was sitting in the kitchen doorway with the expression he reserved for situations he'd predicted and nobody had listened to him about. James called at 4:17 p.m. She almost didn't answer that one either, and she couldn't have explained why. Some instinct towards self-preservation that arrived 3 seconds too late. She picked up on the fourth ring. "You've seen the photos," he said. No preamble, no apology for the intrusion. "I've seen the photos. And Christina called you." "She did." Natalie moved toward the window, leaning her shoulder against the frame. Outside, Park Slope was doing its Saturday afternoon thing. A couple walking a dog that was too large for the sidewalk, a kid on a scooter, someone arranging flowers in the window of the shop across the street. Ordinary and specific and completely indifferent to her situation. She was very thorough. She usually is. Something in his voice was difficult to locate, not quite irritation, not quite resignation. Something between the two with a layer underneath that she didn't have enough information yet to name. "I'm calling to tell you that I've asked her to step back from direct contact. This is not something that requires her involvement." She disagreed with that assessment. She often does. A pause. "Are you all right?" The question caught her off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because of how it was asked. Direct. No performance of concern, no careful professional distance. Just the question sitting there waiting. "I'm fine," she said, then immediately, "It's a little strange having your morning organized by strangers." "I imagine so." Another pause, longer this time. "I can have my communications team issue a statement if you'd prefer, something vague enough to close the conversation." She looked out the window. The flower shop owner had finished her arrangement and stepped back to assess it, tilting her head at her own work. "Would that actually close it?" "Probably not entirely." "Then don't bother." She turned from the window and moved to the couch, tucking one leg beneath her. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Christina called me within 48 hours of those photos going up. How fast does she usually move?" A beat of silence. Then something that might have been the ghost of a smile in his voice. "She's thorough." "You already said that." "It bears repeating." Natalie laughed despite herself, brief, quiet, real. And the conversation, which had been scheduled as a 5-minute logistics update, kept going. Past the flowers, past the coffee she made and forgot on the counter, past the hour mark, while Freud relocated from the doorway to the cushion beside her and made 3 complete circles before settling, and the October light through the window turned from afternoon gold to early evening amber. James talked. Not extensively. He wasn't built for it. But more than she'd expected. She asked a question about a building she'd seen in one of the older photos circulating, something about a development project, and he answered without redirecting, without the careful, public-facing version she would have expected. He talked like someone who had forgotten for a moment, to be guarded. She noticed. She didn't say so. When the call finally ended, she sat for a moment in the quiet of her apartment, the city sounds filtering in, Freud's steady warmth beside her. and felt something settle in her chest that she wasn't ready to examine closely. It wasn't comfort, exactly. It was something adjacent to it, something she hadn't felt in long enough that she'd almost forgotten what to call it. What Christina Vale had already set in motion, however, had only just begun. She heard the knock at 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. Natalie wasn't expecting anyone. She was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with her laptop, 3 browser tabs open, and the particular low-grade stress of a freelance writer on deadline. The kind where every sentence feels like pulling something heavy uphill, and the coffee has gone cold twice already. Freud was asleep on top of her notes, which was both inconvenient and, she had decided, his editorial opinion. The knock came again, precise, unhurried. The knock of someone who was certain they would be answered. She opened the door. Christina Vale was exactly what her voice had suggested. Mid-40s, sharp-featured, dressed in a camel wool coat that probably cost more than Natalie's laptop and phone combined. Her dark hair was pulled back with the kind of severity that suggested it was a permanent decision rather than a daily one. She carried a structured leather bag and the expression of someone who had arrived not to have a conversation, but to deliver one. Ms. Andrade. A nod, not unfriendly, precise. May I come in? Natalie considered the question for exactly 2 seconds. Then she stepped aside. Christina didn't sit immediately. She moved through the small entryway into the living room with a measured, unhurried assessment that reminded Natalie of the way certain people enter a room and catalogue it without appearing to look. The bookshelves organized by color and then by chaos, the gallery wall of mismatched frames, the freelancer's battlefield of the coffee table. Freud opened one eye from his position on the notes, decided Christina was beneath his concern, and closed it again. Natalie crossed her arms and stayed standing. You could have called. I prefer certain conversations in person. Christina set her bag on the chair Natalie hadn't offered and sat on the couch with the composure of someone who had never once in her life felt like an intrusion. This won't take long. It already has. Something flickered across Christina's face. Not quite amusement, not quite irritation. A recognition, maybe, that she was dealing with someone who wasn't going to be managed easily. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Natalie with the direct, clinical attention of someone preparing to operate. I'm not here to threaten you, she said. I want to be clear about that. Noted. I'm here because I've spent 14 years protecting James Menezes' professional interests, and I'm very good at my job. She paused. Which means I'm also very good at recognizing patterns. And the pattern here concerns me. Natalie said nothing. She'd learned early in her career that silence was a more useful tool than most people gave it credit for. Christina continued. You're a freelance writer, $3,900 a month in rent, which you cover reliably but without much margin. A modest digital footprint, nothing damaging, nothing curated. You have an ex-partner named Rafael Sousa, who ended a 4-year relationship 18 months ago. You have a cat named after a psychoanalyst. A brief pause. That last detail is irrelevant. I mention it only to be transparent about the scope of what I know. The room felt very still. The press, Christina said, will not be as measured as I am. They will find the same information I found, the rent, the ex, the gap between your world and his, and they will construct a narrative from it that neither of you will enjoy. They will do it quickly, and they will do it with enthusiasm because James Menezes has been private for a very long time, and the public finds that kind of privacy provocative. She tilted her head slightly. You will be the story, Ms. Andrade. Not him. You. Natalie kept her arms crossed, kept her voice level. Is that the part where I'm supposed to agree to disappear quietly? It's the part where I give you accurate information and allow you to make an informed decision. Christina held her gaze without blinking. I'm not your enemy. I'm a woman who is very good at seeing how things end before they've begun. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, the kind you can feel pressing on your sternum if you're paying attention. Thank you for coming, Natalie said, evenly. I'll think about what you've said. Christina picked up her bag, stood, and buttoned her coat with the efficiency of someone who had said everything she'd come to say. At the door she paused without turning around. "For what it's worth," she said, and her voice had shifted, barely, just beneath the surface. "I don't doubt that you're exactly who you appear to be. That's precisely what worries me." Then she was gone. Natalie stood in the middle of her living room for a long time after the door closed. She didn't call anyone. She didn't open her laptop. She picked up her cold coffee, looked at it, put it back down. Freud relocated from the notes to the couch cushion closest to her and settled there without being invited, which was the closest he ever came to comfort. The worst part, the part that sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong, was that Christina wasn't entirely wrong. She'd heard a version of it before, worded differently. Amazing, but not quite right. The implication was always the same, that the way Natalie existed in the world, loud in her observations, unfiltered in her reactions, genuinely and sometimes inconveniently herself, was charming in small doses and complicated in larger ones. Good for a laugh, not good for a life. She'd spent 18 months building walls around that belief. Quiet ones, functional ones, the kind you don't notice until someone walks up and points at them directly. She looked at the ceiling. The city hummed outside her window. Freud pressed his head against her thigh with a weight that was entirely deliberate. She knew this feeling. The pull toward exit, the instinct to simplify everything by simply not being present for it anymore. She'd gotten very good at disappearing before she could be left. The question was whether this time she would actually go. She didn't block him. That was the thing Natalie told herself later. That it hadn't been a clean break, not really, because she hadn't done the decisive thing. She'd just stopped. Stopped answering within minutes, then within hours, then not at all. Left his last message on read at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday and told herself she was protecting something, though she couldn't have said clearly what. Herself, maybe, or him. Or the specific fragile thing that had been building between them that she didn't have a name for yet and was afraid to examine too closely. She took the Chicago assignment the next morning. A literary festival in Wicker Park. 3 days, 4 interviews, a profile piece for a culture magazine that paid modestly but consistently. She packed her grey carry-on, told Freud that Mrs. Okafor next door would feed him and that he should be civil about it, and took the 6 a.m. flight out of LaGuardia, with the particular relief of someone putting physical distance between themselves and a feeling they haven't processed. Chicago received her with cold, direct wind and a sky the color of brushed steel. She liked it immediately. The festival was held across 2 venues in Wicker Park, a restored theatre and a bookshop with exposed brick walls and the particular smell of old paper and ambition. She spent the first day conducting interviews, the second writing in a cafe on Milwaukee Avenue with her headphones in, and her second cortado going warm beside the keyboard. She was good at this. The work, the clean, manageable structure of deadline and output, where effort produced results and the variables were largely within her control. She was in the middle of a sentence on the 3rd afternoon when the chair across from her was pulled out. She looked up. James Menezes set his phone face down on the table, looked at her with that direct, unreadable attention she'd spent 2 weeks trying to stop thinking about, and said, "You stopped answering." Natalie pulled her headphones down around her neck. The cafe hummed around them, espresso machine, low conversation. Wilco playing at a volume designed to suggest atmosphere without demanding attention. Outside the window, Wicker Park moved through its afternoon with complete indifference to the two of them. "How did you know I was here?" she asked. "Your byline." The festival program listed contributing press. He said it without apology, without the defensiveness of someone who'd tracked her down and knew it. Just fact, laid flat on the table between them. "You read the festival program?" "I was already in Chicago." A pause. "Board meeting." It ended early. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. Neither of them said the obvious thing, which was that board meetings ending early and festival programs were a very thin explanation for a man sitting across from her in a Wicker Park cafe on a Tuesday afternoon. "I was going to answer," she said finally. "I know." "You don't know that?" "No," he admitted, "but I preferred assuming it." Something shifted in his expression. Not vulnerability exactly, but the place just beside it, where honesty lives when it's not performing. "I don't do this." "Do what?" appear in other cities uninvited. And yet. The corner of his mouth moved. Are you going to make me leave? Natalie looked at her laptop screen. The half-finished sentence waited there, patient and undemanding. She looked back at him. I'm going to finish this paragraph first. He nodded, picked up her coffee without asking, realized it was cold, and set it back down with a slight expression of concern that was so unexpectedly human she almost laughed. There's a better cafe 2 blocks north, he said. I know, I like this one. Why? The chairs are uncomfortable enough to keep me focused. He considered this seriously. That's either very disciplined or very strange. Probably both. They stayed for 2 hours, then moved. Not to the cafe 2 blocks north, but to a place James seemed to know. A quieter spot on a side street with good light and a corner table that felt like it had been waiting for a conversation that needed privacy. They ordered without ceremony. The afternoon deepened around them. And then, without entirely planning it, they talked. Not the careful, perimeter-maintaining conversation of 2 people managing a complicated situation. Something else. The kind of talking that happens when the usual scaffolding comes down, and what's underneath is just 2 people being honest in the same direction. James spoke first, quietly, without the professional remove she'd come to expect from him. He talked about the accident that had cost him the use of his legs at 28, a car, a wet highway, a moment that had rearranged everything. He didn't describe it dramatically. He described it the way you describe something you've finished grieving, but haven't finished understanding. What came after, he said, was stranger than the event itself. Watching people reorganize their behavior around him. Watching intimacy transform into management. Watching relationships quietly reclassify themselves into something that looked like care, but felt like distance. Everyone started being very careful with me, he said. And I understood it. I just couldn't figure out how to want it. Natalie turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. Outside, the street had gone amber with late afternoon light. Raphael, my ex, she said, and the name came out easier than she expected. Told me I was amazing but not quite right. 4 years in. She paused. He said it like it was a compliment with a condition attached, like I was a place he'd visited and enjoyed, but didn't want to live. James was quiet for a moment. That's a precise kind of cruelty. I don't think he meant it cruelly. That doesn't make it less precise. She looked at him. He was watching her with that attention, the one that didn't waver, didn't perform, didn't reach for the comfortable thing to say instead of the true thing. It was, she thought, the most sustained she'd felt seen in longer than she wanted to calculate. They left the cafe as the streetlights came on, walking, him moving beside her with the easy, self-possessed rhythm she'd stopped noticing was notable, back toward the hotel district, talking about nothing significant and somehow not stopping. In the elevator, she pressed the button for her floor. The doors closed. The small brass-lit box began to rise, and in the particular quiet of that enclosed space, something shifted. The air, the distance, the careful arrangement of their respective guards. She turned to say something. He was already looking at her. The elevator stopped with a soft ding. Wrong floor, neither of them moved. The doors opened onto an empty hallway and stayed open, patient and oblivious, while the 2 of them stood in the small lit space with the city somewhere below them and approximately 3 inches of charged air between them that neither had crossed and neither had stepped back from. The doors began to close again. Neither of them pressed a button. New York received them back the way it always does, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without the faintest interest in what had happened elsewhere. The city didn't know about the elevator, didn't know about the cafe in Wicker Park, or the amber afternoon light, or the things that had been said out loud for the first time in a long time. It just kept moving. Horns and scaffolding and the particular smell of October giving way to November. Cold now with an edge that meant business. And Natalie moved through it the way she always had, except that something underneath had quietly rearranged itself. And she wasn't entirely sure what to do with the new configuration. They didn't talk about Chicago, not directly, but they talked about everything adjacent to it, texts that arrived at 11 p.m. With no particular subject, observations sent without context that somehow made complete sense to the other person. A photo James sent of a building detail in Tribeca she'd mentioned admiring once. A voice note Natalie sent at midnight, slightly delirious from deadline fatigue, about a sentence she'd rewritten 11 times and still didn't trust. He'd responded 4 minutes later with a single line. The 11th version. It's always the 11th. She'd stared at that message longer than was reasonable. There were dinners that weren't called dinners. A Tuesday evening at a Japanese restaurant in the West Village, where they'd ended up seated at the bar, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm beside hers, talking about a documentary she'd half-watched, and he'd actually read the source material for. A Thursday walk through the High Line that started as incidental. She'd been heading somewhere, he'd been heading somewhere. They'd ended up heading the same direction for 40 minutes, where the conversation moved so fluidly from architecture to childhood, to the strange specific grief of things you'd wanted, and stopped wanting that she'd arrived home an hour later than intended and hadn't noticed. She noticed everything else, though. She noticed that he always positioned himself at tables so he could see the room, not paranoia, just habit, the quiet awareness of someone who'd learned to read spaces before entering them. She noticed that he never explained himself unnecessarily and never let a silence collapse into performance, which was rarer than people understood. She noticed that when he was interested in something, his whole quality of attention shifted, sharpened, in a way that was almost physical. She also noticed that she had stopped editing herself around him. That was the thing that kept arriving uninvited when she was trying to work, or sleep, or have a normal interaction with Freud that didn't involve thinking about James Menezes. She said things around him, unfiltered, half-formed, occasionally absurd things, and he received them without adjustment, without the micro-expressions she'd learned to watch for in other people that meant too much, dial it back. He just listened, responded, sometimes disagreed, directly and without padding, which she found more comforting than agreement would have been. She was terrified, not of him, of the wanting, of how specific it had become, how it had moved past the general warmth of enjoying someone's company into something with shape and weight and consequence. She'd been here before, not here exactly, but in the neighborhood, and she knew what it cost when the thing you'd started to build turned out to be constructed on someone else's terms. Amazing, but not quite right. She was very good at wanting things that worked out to be almost. She'd developed a whole quiet expertise in it. It was raining on a Friday night when it happened, not dramatically, no thunder, no cinematic downpour. Just the steady, grey New York rain that makes the city look like a photograph of itself, the streets reflecting light in long, wavering columns. Natalie had been at a magazine event in Soho that had ended earlier than expected, and she was standing in front of her building with her umbrella doing a structurally questionable job when a car she recognized pulled up to the curb. The window came down. "You're getting rained on," James said. "I'm aware. Do you want a ride?" "I'm already home." He looked at the building behind her, then back at her. "Then why are you standing outside?" It was, she realized, a genuinely good question. She'd been standing there for 6 minutes, she now understood, not because she was going inside, but because she'd been thinking about him, which was, she decided immediately, information she was going to take to her grave. "I was enjoying the rain," she said. "You had the expression of someone calculating something complicated." Same thing. He looked at her for a long moment. The rain moved between them, soft and indifferent. The city carried on its Friday night business around the parked car. A couple walking close under one umbrella, a delivery cyclist in a yellow slicker, the muffled bass from a bar somewhere down the block. "I think we're doing a very poor job of pretending," Natalie said. She said it with the irony she kept ready for moments that scared her, the voice she used when she wanted to say something real and needed a layer of lightness to make it survivable. James was quiet for a moment. The rain tapped steadily on the roof of the car, on her umbrella, on the shoulders of her coat. "I think," he said finally, "we stopped pretending some time ago." The words landed without drama, quiet, direct, with the particular weight of something that had been true for a while and was only now being said out loud. She felt it move through her the way true things do, not like a surprise, but like a recognition, like finding a word you'd been searching for without knowing you were searching. She stood in the rain and looked at him through the open window, and felt the wanting, specific, weighted, consequential, settle into something that was almost steady. "That's a problem," she said softly. "Yes," he agreed. And then, after a beat that contained everything neither of them had said for weeks, "Are you going inside?" Natalie looked up at her building. At the lit windows, the warm lobby visible through the glass doors, Freud presumably arranged on the couch with the television remote she kept losing. She looked back at James. "Not yet," she said. The rain kept falling, and neither of them moved to end the moment. The story broke on a Wednesday, not a slow leak, a detonation. A tabloid piece published at 6 a.m. with the particular timing of something designed to catch people before they'd had enough coffee to think clearly. The headline was the kind that trades accuracy for impact. Menezes and the mystery writer, inside the billionaire's secret romance. Below it, a photograph from the wedding, the one where she was laughing and he was watching her, cropped and lit and captioned in a way that made it look like evidence of something it wasn't. Or maybe, she thought, reading it at her kitchen counter with Freud winding around her ankles, evidence of something that was. The piece had details, not all of them wrong, which was the most unsettling part. Her name, her neighborhood, her freelance work, the ex, Raphael's name rendered in one sentence with the precision of a paper cut. There were quotes from unnamed sources. There was a sidebar about James's history of privacy and what the public appearance of a relationship might signal for the Meridian Group's upcoming expansion. Christina Vale was mentioned twice, both times as a spokesperson who declined to comment. Natalie read it once, all the way through. Then she put her phone down. She made coffee. Real coffee, the stovetop kind that required attention and produced results worth waiting for. She stood at the stove and listened to the percolation and looked out the window at the November morning, grey still, the street below not yet fully awake. A woman walked a dog in a yellow raincoat. A delivery truck idled at the corner, ordinary and indifferent and exactly what she needed to look at. Her phone lit up 7 times in 4 minutes. Clara, her editor, 2 numbers she didn't recognize, a publicist she'd interviewed once who was apparently now monitoring her life, her mother, in what appeared to be her first breaking news text in recorded history. "Mija, there's an article. Call me." And James. She didn't call her mother. She didn't call Clara. She put on her coat, the good one, charcoal wool, the one she wore when she needed to feel like a version of herself that was slightly more assembled than she currently was, and she took the subway to Midtown. She hadn't been to his building before. It was the kind of address that existed in a register of the city she moved through but rarely entered, a glass tower in the 50s, with a lobby that had the dimensions and acoustics of a very tasteful museum. The concierge called up without expression. The elevator was fast and quiet and opened directly into a private floor. James was there when the doors opened. He was in a grey shirt, no coat, the kind of stillness about him that suggested he'd been awake for hours. Behind him, the penthouse opened into floor-to-ceiling windows, and the whole of Manhattan spread beyond the glass. 1,000 lit rectangles against the low November sky, the city wearing its morning fog, like something considered. He didn't say, "I told you this would happen." He didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "this is manageable," or any of the things a person says when they're trying to convert a moment into a problem with a solution. He just looked at her, that direct, undeflected attention, and waited, which was, she would think later, exactly right. "I didn't come because I felt like I had to," Natalie said. Her voice was steady. She'd decided that on the subway, that if she was going to say it, she was going to say it without irony, without the protective layer of humor she kept ready for moments that scared her. Just the sentence, plain and unambiguous, standing on its own. "I came because I wanted to." She held his gaze. "There's a difference, and I need you to know that I know the difference." The city moved behind him, indifferent and luminous. A plane crossed the sky in the far distance, a slow red blink moving south. James was very still in the way he was always still, not absence, but the opposite of it. Full presence, calibrated and complete. "I know," he said. "I'm not sure you do." Natalie. Her name in his voice had a quality she'd noticed weeks ago and chosen not to examine. Low, deliberate, the way he said things he meant without decoration. I know. She crossed the room. Not dramatically. No rush, no collapse of distance. Just the decision enacted, one step and then another, until she was close enough that she could see the specific quality of his expression. That look she'd been cataloguing since Brooklyn, the one she'd learned to read in increments. It wasn't guarded now, it wasn't performing composure or managing a situation. It was open in the way that cost something, and directed entirely at her. She put her hand on his. Just that, her hand on his, warm and deliberate in the grey November morning light with Manhattan spread behind them, like something they'd been given temporarily, and should probably not take for granted. "The article is going to run follow-ups," she said. "Yes." "Christina is going to have opinions." "She always does." "And I'm still here." "Yes," he said quietly. "You are." Outside, the city moved through its Wednesday. Cabs and construction, and the distant percussion of a helicopter somewhere over the river. The ordinary, relentless, beautiful machinery of New York, entirely unconcerned with the two people standing in the penthouse light, choosing each other without performance or condition. Natalie looked at their hands, then at him. The look he gave her back, steady, unguarded, weighted with everything the previous weeks had been building toward, said what neither of them needed to put into words. Some things, she was learning, didn't require irony to survive. But what the morning after would ask of both of them, that was something neither had prepared for. The morning arrived without asking permission. It came the way November mornings do in New York, gradually then all at once, grey light pressing through the floor-to-ceiling windows in slow increments until the penthouse was filled with something that wasn't quite day yet but had decided to become it. The kind of light that makes everything look considered, unhurried, like the city had agreed, just this once, to be gentle about it. Natalie noticed it from the kitchen. She was standing at the marble counter in James's grey Henley, borrowed without asking, which felt like its own kind of statement, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that was heavier than any mug she owned, and probably cost more than she wanted to calculate. The coffee was good, genuinely specifically good, the kind that suggested someone had thought carefully about the process rather than just the result. She hadn't expected him to make coffee. That was the thing that kept arriving. Not the grand gestures, not the penthouse or the car, or the particular quality of his attention, which she'd had weeks to adjust to. The small things. The coffee, made while she was still assembling herself in the bathroom. The way he'd left the mug on the counter at exactly the height she'd naturally reach, without thinking. The quiet of the apartment, which wasn't the silence of absence, but the silence of someone who understood that mornings didn't require filling. She heard the soft movement of his chair across the hardwood before she saw him. James came around the kitchen island and stopped on the other side of the counter, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, or rather, hadn't seen fully formed before. She'd caught pieces of it, the edge of it in Chicago, in the elevator light, the suggestion of it on the Friday sidewalk in the rain. But here in the grey November morning, without the management of public space or the structure of their careful negotiations, it was complete, unguarded, light, entire. "You found the coffee," he said. "You made it obvious." She lifted the mug slightly. "This is very good. Ethiopian blend, single origin." He moved to the other side of the counter, reaching past her for his own mug with the easy, unconsidered proximity of someone who had stopped calculating distance. His arm brushed hers. Neither of them remarked on it. "The beans matter more than the method. Most people get that backwards. Is that a metaphor?" "It's a coffee opinion." He looked at her sideways. "Not everything is a metaphor. In my experience, the things that aren't metaphors are usually the ones that turn out to be metaphors." He considered this with the seriousness he gave most things, which was one of the qualities she'd stopped pretending not to find compelling. "That's either very insightful or very exhausting." "Probably both." A sound came from the living room. They both turned. Freud, who had arrived the previous evening in his carrier with the long-suffering dignity of a cat, who had not been consulted about any of this, was sitting squarely in the center of James's lap, eyes half closed, the specific quality of his stillness suggesting he had assessed the situation and rendered a verdict entirely in his own favor. Natalie stared. "He jumped up about 20 minutes ago. James said, with the tone of a man reporting a minor meteorological event. "He doesn't do that." She looked at Freud. Freud looked back with the expression of a cat who was aware he'd been discussed and found the whole business beneath him. "He has never voluntarily sat on anyone. Not even me, most of the time. Perhaps he has better taste than you give him credit for. Perhaps he's a traitor." James looked down at Freud with something that might, in the right light, have been the beginning of affection. He scratched behind the cat's left ear with a careful, deliberate motion, and Freud, the same cat who had once knocked a glass of water off the nightstand because Natalie had answered a phone call during his dinner hour, closed his eyes and began, unmistakably, to purr. Natalie pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling. "Don't read into it," she said. "I'm not reading into anything." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm just noting that your cat has better instincts than his reputation suggests." She brought her coffee around to the living room and sat on the end of the long grey couch, tucking her feet beneath her. The city was fully visible now, the morning having committed, the fog lifting to reveal the particular mid-November clarity that makes Manhattan look sharp-edged and deliberate. From this height, she could see the river, a silver line at the edge of things. She could see the grid of streets beginning their Wednesday, the ordinary, relentless machinery of it, indifferent and beautiful. "What are you thinking?" James asked. She turned from the window. He was watching her, still across the room, Freud, a warm, implausible weight in his lap, with that quality of attention that she'd stopped being surprised by and started simply receiving. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that I spent a lot of time being very certain this wasn't for me. This, she gestured vaguely, at the apartment, at the morning, at the particular configuration of the two of them in it. The thing where you stop managing the distance and just stay." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a helicopter moved along the river, small and purposeful. "What changed?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she was learning to think around him, without the protective irony, without the deflection. "I got tired of being very good at leaving," she said finally. "It turns out that's not actually a skill worth keeping." James looked at her steadily. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The morning light moved across the floor between them in slow degrees. Freud purred. The city carried on its business below, and in the space of the penthouse, warm and quiet and filled with the specific ease of two people who had stopped pretending the distance was necessary, something settled into place that felt less like an arrival and more like a beginning. Not the beginning of something fragile, the beginning of something being built, carefully, with attention, by two people who had both, in their different ways, learned the cost of building badly. Natalie looked at her coffee, then at James, then at Freud, who had opened one eye as if monitoring the situation for quality control. "He's going to want his breakfast," she said. "I bought food yesterday," James said. Simply, completely, as if this required no explanation. She stared at him. "You bought cat food. You mentioned the brand once. It seemed useful information." The warmth that moved through her chest at that, quiet and specific and entirely disproportionate to the subject of cat food, was something she decided not to examine too carefully. Some things were better received than analyzed. "James," she said. "Yes." "This is going to be complicated." He looked at her with the directness she'd learned to read as his version of warmth, steady, unhurried, completely without deflection. "Most things worth doing are," he said. What neither of them had factored in was what Christina Vale was already preparing to say. 4 months have a way of rearranging things quietly. Not all at once, not in the dramatic, cinematic way that stories sometimes suggest, where transformation arrives in a single clarifying moment and everything before it becomes prologue. Real change, Natalie had learned, moved more like the city outside James's windows. Incrementally, continuously, each small shift so gradual that you only understood the distance traveled when you stopped and looked back at where you'd started. She looked back sometimes. Couldn't help it. The article had run its follow-ups as predicted. 3 pieces in the first week, 2 more the week after. Then a profile request from a magazine she actually respected, that James had declined on both their behalves with a single courteous email that Christina had apparently read 4 times before conceding it was adequate. The press had found other stories, the way press always does, pulled toward the next bright thing with the reliable attention span of something that feeds on novelty. By December, the photographs from the Hamptons wedding had been replaced by other photographs, other names, other narratives, constructed from insufficient evidence. The city moved on. James and Natalie moved differently. It was a Tuesday in late February, when Christina Vale appeared in the doorway of the Meridian Group's main conference room, holding a bound document and wearing an expression that Natalie, who had by now developed a working taxonomy of Christina's expressions, identified as reluctantly satisfied. Natalie was there because James had asked her to be, and because she'd stopped making decisions based on what was strategically comfortable approximately 3 months ago. She sat beside him at the long glass table with her notebook open and her coffee, Ethiopian blend, single origin, she'd stopped drinking anything else, and watched Christina set the document down with the ceremony of someone presenting evidence. The Meridian Group's public favorability index, Christina said, is at its highest point in 11 years. She opened to a page of graphs. Investor confidence is up 14% over the previous quarter. Media sentiment has shifted from predominantly neutral to predominantly positive. She paused, the particular pause of someone arriving at a conclusion that requires a specific calibration of expression to deliver correctly. The narrative around James's personal life, rather than creating the liability I projected, appears to have humanized the company's public profile in ways that 5 years of communications strategy did not. The room was quiet. James looked at the graphs. Then at Christina. "You're saying you were wrong?" "I'm saying the data presents findings that differ from my initial projections." She closed the document with a precise motion. "Which is as close as I come." "I know," he said. And something in his voice, dry, almost warm, suggested this was not a conversation he was displeased to be having. Christina looked at Natalie then, directly, without the surgical remove of their first meeting. Something in her expression had shifted, not softened exactly, because Christina Vale did not soften but adjusted, recalibrated, the look of someone who had updated a variable in a model they'd been running for a long time. "You were not," Christina said carefully, "what I anticipated." Natalie held her gaze. "I know." "That was not," Christina added after a beat, "a criticism." She picked up her document, nodded once to James and left the room with the brisk efficiency of someone who had said everything she intended to say and not one syllable more. The door closed behind her with a soft, conclusive click. James looked at Natalie. Natalie looked at James. "Was that an apology?" she asked. "From Christina?" He considered it. It was the structural equivalent of one. "I'd accept it. I'm going to frame that page of graphs. I'll have it mounted." Raphael appeared 3 weeks later. She saw him across the room at a mutual friends gallery opening in Chelsea, the kind of event that exists in that specific New York stratum where everyone knows everyone through 2 degrees of creative industry, and the wine is always exactly adequate. He looked the same. Well-dressed, easy smile, the particular handsomeness that had once rearranged her thinking and now registered as simply a face she recognized. He found her near the back, by a large canvas in shades of blue, and said her name with the careful warmth of someone who had rehearsed the approach. "You look well," Raphael said. "I am well," she said, simply. Without the layer of subtext, the sentence would have carried 18 months ago. He glanced across the room to where James was speaking with the gallery owner, unhurried and self-possessed, the room accommodating him the way rooms had learned to do. Raphael looked back at her with an expression she recognized, the arithmetic of someone calculating what they'd walked away from. "I've been thinking," he said, "that I made a mistake." Natalie looked at him. She waited for the old feeling, the pull of it, the complicated ache of 4 years and 1 sentence and all the months of rebuilding after. She waited with genuine curiosity, the way you wait for pain from a bruise you're not sure has healed. Nothing came, not bitterness, not longing. Not the residue of amazing, but not quite right that had lived in her chest for longer than she liked to admit. Just clarity, clean and quiet and complete, like a room that had been properly aired out and was now simply itself. "I think you probably did," she said without cruelty. "I hope you're well, Raphael." She moved back across the room. The wedding was in March. A colleague of Clara's, outdoor ceremony in spite of the cold, a barn venue upstate that had been converted into something warm and strung with light, the kind of wedding that commits to romance without apology and pulls it off. Someone Natalie half recognized from Clara's book club stopped her near the drinks table, looking between her and James with the particular brightness of someone assembling a story. "How did you two meet?" the woman asked. The question was directed at both of them, but her eyes went to Natalie first. Natalie looked at James. He looked back at her. That look, the one she knew now in every variation, the one that had started as unreadable and become, over months of careful attention, the most legible thing in her life. She looked back at the woman. "I sent a message to the wrong number," Natalie said. "Late at night, a little too much wine. I asked a stranger to pretend to like me for a few hours." The woman laughed, delighted, leaning in. "And?" James set his hand over Natalie's on the table, warm, unhurried, completely without performance. She felt it move through her the way his touch always did, like a sentence that means exactly what it says. "It was the best mistake I ever made," he said. Natalie turned to look at him. He was already looking at her, steady and unguarded and entirely present, the city and the noise and the March cold existing somewhere far outside the specific warmth of that look. She thought about the Thursday night, the wine, the cheese, the cat judging her from the coffee table. The message sent without thinking to a name she'd misread in a contact list, the black car she hadn't been prepared for, and the man in it she'd been even less prepared for, and every moment between that sidewalk in Brooklyn and this barn in March that had rearranged her quietly and completely. She thought about how the wrong number had led, with the particular logic of things that were always going to happen, to exactly the right place. "It really was," she said. Outside, the March night was cold and clear, and full of stars that the city usually drowned out, but that existed here, upstate, in their proper abundance. Inside, the music had started, something warm and unhurried, and the lights strung above them made everything look like a photograph of itself, golden and specific and real. Freud was at home, presumably sitting on something he wasn't supposed to sit on. Everything else was exactly where it was supposed to be. And that, it turns out, is what choosing looks like. Not a single moment, but every small moment that comes after, renewed. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right circumstance, the right version of themselves to finally show up and deserve what they want. Natalie Andrade spent 4 years doing exactly that, building careful walls and calling them wisdom. And then at 11:47 on a Thursday night, with wine and bad lighting and absolutely no plan, she sent a message to the wrong number, and the walls came down anyway. Not dramatically. Just quietly, brick by brick, in the back of a black car and a Chicago cafe and a rain-soaked Brooklyn sidewalk, in the specific warmth of a man who looked at her like she was already enough. Some mistakes, it turns out, know exactly what they're doing. What wall have you been calling wisdom, and what might be waiting on the other side of letting it down? If this story moved something in you, let it show. Like this, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. Every single one of you matters more than you know.
This chapter has ended, but another one is already waiting for you.